morning, good evening, and good afternoon, listeners, to our usual weekly Straight Talk program. I would like to welcome you once again to another what I would consider interesting Straight Talk that I'm sure would be of interest to you. This week, we will talk about the voting by the disciplined services. This is an extremely important exercise and it marks the commencement of actual voting for the March 2nd elections. Although proxy voting or voting by proxy has already been initiated. But the fact of the matter is, as distinct from proxy voting, actual voting is what people pay much attention to. On the 23rd of February, that is to this month and this year, the discipline services will be exercising the franchise. And by discipline services, we mean in this regard the Guyana Police Force, the Guyana Defense Force, and the Guyana Prison Service. The Guyana Fire Service is part of the discipline services, but the fact of the matter is that at elections time, just in case of any major incident in respect of fire, the Guyana Fire Service remains in service and, as they would say, in line, and would be required to respond to any emergency that takes place on election day. As such, the Guyana Fire Service will not be voting on the 23rd of February. They will be voting along with the civilians on March the 2nd. On the 23rd of February, the discipline services that will be voting will comprise of the following: 6,702 members of the Guyana Police Force, 3,336 members of the Guyana Defense Force, and 4,088 members of the Guyana Prison Service. Let me repeat that. 6,702 members of the Guyana Police Force, 3,036 members of the Guyana Defense Force, and 4,088 members of the Guyana Prison Service. That brings us to a total of 20,266 persons who will be voting as members of the discipline services. Now, out of that 20,266 members of the discipline services, we have on the voters list 661,028 eligible voters. Now that's a huge list of voters, which many have either complained, disputed, or accepted as per normal when continuous registration takes place, and especially when no name can be removed from the voters list unless it is duly authorized and duly provided with documents for it to happen, for example, in the case of a person who may have died. So on the 23rd of February, the discipline services will be casting their votes. I would like to take the opportunity on this occasion to say a few words about our track record in respect to the provision of goods and services, as well as remunerative benefits to the discipline services of our country. Ever since 1992, with Chedi Jagan as the presidential candidate, Jagan made the point over and over again at his public meetings that when he assumes office, he will review the budgetary allocations to the various government agencies and departments. In this regard, a study was made and it was found that the Office of the President, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and many other ministries were receiving more budgetary allocation than Education, Health, and Police and other members of the discipline services. He wanted to change that, to provide much more money to the social services sector and the security sector as well. Consequently, on assumption to office, President Jagan made drastic changes in the budgetary allocations to government agencies and departments. More money was allocated to education and health, and more money was allocated to the Guyana Police Force and other members of the discipline services. In other words, we saw a steep rise in remunerative benefits and provision of goods and services to the discipline services since 1992. A check on the budgetary allocation to all of these organizations that provide security for our country has always been increasing over the years from 1992 to 2015 when we left the government. And so the point I'd like to make is that the People's Progressive Party Civic has always held in high esteem the services provided by the discipline services, as well as the question of security to the nation and public safety and security to the people of Guyana. Let us not take into consideration the negative comments by some who have always sought to paint a dark picture of the PPP when it was in office. The facts speak for themselves. The talk that so many African Guyanese were killed during the so-called Troubles is a number that is constantly being disputed. And in fact, the leader of the opposition has constantly challenged Mr. Jagdeo to establish a commission of inquiry into that period in our country's history. He has refused to do so, and the question as to why he's reluctant to do so is a matter which he himself has to answer. And notwithstanding the criticisms some have made of the Guyana, of the People's Progressive Party government, we know that the facts are quite to the contrary of these criticisms. The party, when it was in government, took a number of initiatives to improve the services provided by the Guyana Police Force, for example. I have had the honor and privilege of serving as Minister of Home Affairs for almost 10 years. That is 2 terms. And I have been very comfortable and been very proud in being the Minister of the Guyana Police Force, the Guyana Fire Service, the Guyana Prison Service, the Custom Anti-Narcotics Unit, and all other members of the discipline services, save and except the Guyana Defense Force, which fell under the Office of the President and the Defense Board, which I had the privilege of serving in as well. Number of reforms were carried out in these organizations. Reforms in respect to the Guyana Police Force, the Guyana Prison Service, and the Guyana Fire Service. Strategic plans were drawn up with respect to these reforms, and the implementation of these reforms were proceeding at a very magnificent pace due to the resources provided either by donor agencies or from the budget itself provided by the government of Guyana through the National Assembly. We also propose name changes for some of these organizations. For example, we proposed the change of the name Guyana Police Force to Guyana Police Service. I noticed that the ruling APNU AFC coalition government, they are now talking about changing the name of the Guyana Police Force to the very name we had proposed in the National Assembly and which they had rejected. But we are on record in the Hansard proposing the name change of Guyana Police Force to Guyana Police Service. In addition, we also propose a name change for the Guyana Prison Service, and that is for it to be called the Guyana Prison and Correctional Service. I notice also that the coalition government is proposing the same change of name that we have proposed in the National Assembly and which they had rejected. We had also made a proposal that the name of the Guyana Fire Service be changed to the Guyana Fire and Ambulance Service. Now, these changes were not cosmetic. They were not intended to be cosmetic changes or just the change in a name, but a change in essence, a change in substance, a change in this kind of quality of service provided to the people of Guyana by these organizations. And in this respect, to back up the name change or the name changes, a number of reforms were authorized by Cabinet within these organizations. Modernization of these organizations was very high on the agenda, to modernize them with the provision of the latest equipment, the latest tools, and with constant training so that these organizations could become state of the art, so to speak, equipped with the necessary tools for them to execute their duties and functions. We also made significant changes in the relations between the Guyana Police Force and the communities around the country. In this respect, community policing groups was very high on the agenda of the past administration, with groups being established throughout the length and breadth of Guyana. And we worked very hard to ensure that these groups work in tandem and work in great cohesion with the Guyana Police Force. And that was an extremely great success at that time when we pursued that policy. We also established what is called a Parliamentary Oversight Committee of the security sector when the troubles had ended in Guyana. That Parliamentary Oversight Committee was to be a bipartisan committee in which both government and opposition would cooperate in addressing threats to crime, threats to our national security, and threats to public safety and security in our country. Unfortunately, the then opposition, APNU and AFC, did not cooperate with that Parliamentary Oversight Committee. But when they came into government, they hastily set it up and had just a few meetings organizing for members to visit police stations across the country, which in my view was not a necessary activity at that point in time. It was not a priority. There were a number of other priorities that we ought to have looked at, including the question of the prison. And I want to submit that had we paid attention to what was happening in the prisons across the country, I doubt whether the fire that took place at the prisons and the riots that took place in our prisons could have been avoided. I'm sure that they could have been avoided, but the fact of the matter is the coalition government, having set up that committee, sought to pay attention to other issues which were not a priority in the view of the general public. I have to also point out that as the disciplined forces go to vote on 23rd of February, it is important to recall the number of pieces of legislation or bills that were passed in the National Assembly. Over 30 pieces of legislation treating with security of our country and our people were laid in the National Assembly, debated, and passed in the House. Legislation, for example, dealing with firearms, the establishment of a firearms license approval board, which took away, to a large extent, the powers of the political head of the Ministry of Home Affairs to grant firearm licenses. Now we understand that the minister, the sitting minister, who really should not be there, is now issuing firearm licenses to the public and not seeking the approval of the Firearm License Approval Board. We established a forensic laboratory. Time was against us insofar as having DNA testing established at that forensic laboratory. Elections came, or I should say elections caught up with us, and as such we could not complete that exercise. But the fact of the matter is, it was in train and we had already started the process to have DNA testing established at the forensic laboratory. Polygraphing of the members of the discipline services was also launched during this period of time. And it turned out to be a very useful exercise because it helped to weed out from these organizations persons who did not pass the polygraph testing and move up others who did pass and had great prospects for promotion. The polygraphing was done, senior members of the Guyana Police Force, of the Guyana Defense Force, and the Customs Anti-Narcotics Unit. When this government came into office, they abandoned polygraph testing, and now we're hearing talk of them going back to it once again. The ill-advised transference of ranks of the Guyana Police Force to interior parts of the country without due regard to the welfare or family interest. Fact of the matter is that in those days, and even up to now, some ranks have taken out mortgages, some ranks have purchased vehicles, and as a result of their transference, it's extremely difficult for those matters to be taken care of by those who are in the city. It is not that ranks ought not to be transferred. Ranks ought to be transferred in order to get a better knowledge of what the country is like. No one is opposed to that. But when political interference steps in, and because of what is perceived to be political sympathies are used to transfer ranks, well, that is a totally different matter and totally unacceptable. We note that in those days, the demographic shifts in criminal activities was what made my period in office take steps to address the movement and the shifting of ranks within the organization itself. The move that this government has taken to establish what is called divisional commanders based on the regional commanders is not really coming to grips with the true facts and the true realities on the ground. I believe that it's important for attention to be paid, more importantly, to the shifting of the criminal enterprise on a demographic basis, and it is on that basis that we need to examine how this matter ought to be addressed. The establishment of a SWAT team came as a very important development within the Guyana Police Force. It raised the level of the police force to greater heights and brought greater prestige to the organization, where the SWAT team was able to deal with critical events that the normal police ranks could not deal with. We established the new officer center at Ivleri, where we pass and you see that huge building, which is used now by the senior ranks of the Guyana Police Force. A police legal advisor was also established during the previous administration's time in office. The former police advisor is now the head of GCOM. Justice Claudette Singh was at one time the legal advisor to the Guyana Police Force. She resigned that position in order to take up the current position which she now holds. But the fact of the matter is that for the Guyana Police Force, a legal advisor is important because the police really cannot advise itself on legal matters, even though they have to go to the Director of Public Prosecutions in order to do so. But an internal legal advisor is an important prerequisite for the force to guide it legally on criminal matters or law enforcement matters as well. My friends, the introduction or the reintroduction of the cadet ranks within the Guyana Police Force was also a very important step in the evolution of the organization. 50 cadet ranks were groomed and cultivated within the organization, and many of these cadets now hold important positions within the structure of the organization. The point I'm making by listing these achievements is that the previous administration, the PPPC, has always paid attention, close attention to the needs of the discipline services. In this respect, the Guyana Prison Service ought not to be excluded or cannot be excluded. Reforms at the Guyana Prison Service took on a totally qualitative dimension, where, for example, there was greater civilian oversight over the prisons. We brought in the private sector. We brought in many non-governmental organizations to assist in overseeing the role and place of the prison service in a new Guyana context. In this respect, we established certain protocols that will deal with custodial as well as correctional. In other words, we beefed up the number of prison service officers, and at the same time beefed up the number of welfare officers in the prison service. We recognize that you need to have a good balance between the custodial and the correctional services provided by the Guyana Prison Service. Prisoners in that institution need to be corrected, because when we look at the background, when you look at the history, some of them might very well be forced offenders or caught for the first time. My point is that they should not be mixed with the hardened criminals, and therefore that is why the prison at Lusignan was designated to be a prison, a model prison for reforming and instituting or implementing correctional policies with respect to prisoners or young prisoners held within the Guyana Prison Service. A strategic plan was rolled out in order to facilitate this transformation of the Guyana Prison Service. So it's not only a question of putting up buildings. It is not only a question of looking at the infrastructures of the Guyana Prison Service. It's also looking at the human factor, the factor that you have human beings within the prison service. Some, of course, are hardened criminals who ought to be given a second opportunity once it is seen that it is possible. And then you have also the young offenders who need to be in the correctional part of a prison service. The Guyana Fire Service also came in for review during our time, and in this respect, a strategic plan was also drawn up for the Guyana Fire Service, and measures were put in place to reform or carry out reforms within the Guyana Fire Service as well. And that is precisely why we established a name change from Guyana Fire Service to Guyana Fire and Ambulance Service. Fire Service is basically a humanitarian service provider. In case of fire, they are there to assist from a humanitarian point of view, to rescue persons who may be trapped in the fire, to rescue animals who may be on a treetop that the people cannot reach or the owners cannot reach, to rescue someone and take them to the nearest hospital for treatment. These are some of the humanitarian aspects of a Guyana Fire Service. So it is not only a question of fighting fires, it's also a question of saving lives. And that is how we saw reforms of the Guyana or within the Guyana Fire Service taking place. So my friends, we need to, as we go to the polls, and I'm addressing specifically the members of the discipline services, particularly those who deal with law enforcement, as we approach February 23rd, and we decide who we will vote for on Elections Day. I think some of you have already made up your minds. We need to recall all these measures that were put in place in order to enhance the capabilities and the capacities of the organizations which you are part of. I should mention also that in relation to the prison service and the fire service, we built new training schools for the trainees belonging or coming into these organizations, recruits coming into these organizations to get the relevant professional training. because of course we were looking to recruit persons who could be trained professionally and not to be found smuggling drugs or any illegal weapon or illegal items into the prison service and such. We believe that these reforms were bearing fruit. In relation to the Guyana Police Force, I omitted to mention that legislation dealing, for example, with traffic laws, reviewing the whole traffic situation, was a major priority for the administration, which I was part of. New legislation pertaining to traffic were laid in the National Assembly. Legislation dealing with hijacking and privacy were laid in the National Assembly and approved in the National Assembly. And as I said, more than 30 pieces of legislation addressing the totality of the crime and public safety and security situation in our country were passed under the PPPC administration and were being implemented with the passage of time. The Discipline Services Commission report, or the disciplines or the agreements and decisions within the Discipline Services Commission, were also being aggressively pursued. I should recall that when we were in government, the then opposition made a big noise about us not implementing the Discipline Services Commission report. And they themselves had pledged that were they to be in government, they would be implementing the Discipline Services Commission report. But lo and behold, they've been in the government for 5 years, and not a single word has been mentioned in respect to implementation of the Discipline Services Commission report. My friends, I think that under the PPPC administration, Guyana has become a much safer nation. People felt a greater sense of security. People felt a greater sense of protection. What we need to do on the 23rd of February is to vote for restoration and not deprivation. Restoration for all that was taken away from members of the discipline services, including the annual 1 month salary, tax-free, for each member of the discipline services. That was of great help to many of these people, including their families. So we need to vote for the restoration and not the deprivation of these benefits that came to you during that time in government. We need to vote for tax relief and not tax burdens that is now burdensome on so many people. You need to vote for plenty and not want. So many people have so many wants and so many needs in our country today. And that is why we need to vote for peace, progress, and prosperity, so that you, once again, would have money in your pocket. You would have a roof over your head and your family's head. You would have a job in which you would be secure, and you would have a life that would be full of peace, happiness, and prosperity. I therefore appeal to each member of the Guyana Police Force, of the Guyana Prison Service, of the Guyana Fire Service, to vote decisively and to vote for a future in which your family, your children, your senior citizens of this country would be able to live a joyful and happy life. Vote PPPC, vote for peace, progress, and prosperity.